you mentioned some privilege and things, growing up in middle class America, I have privileges, no question, over people that are growing up in other countries that education struggles and things. There's no question about it. But I think everybody can probably expand their vision bigger than what they do right now, especially in the world that we live in today. And you alluded to this at the start, anybody anywhere can start a podcast. And yeah, you did it 10 years before it was the booming crazy thing, but anybody can start a podcast. You can be in a village somewhere in India and you got a cell phone connection. You can start a podcast. And if you have good ideas and you've built your ability to speak and things, it may take a lot of work for you to find success, but you can find it because the barrier to entry is so small right now on achieving whatever dream you want to achieve.
I'm Srini Rao, and this is the Unmistakable Creative Podcast, where you get a window into the stories and insights of the most innovative and creative minds who've started movements, built thriving businesses, written best-selling books, and created insanely interesting art. For more, check out our 500-episode archive at unmistakablecreative.com.
Doing creative work can be kind of lonely, and that's why we built the Unmistakable Listener Tribe. The tribe is a community for professionals to connect and support each other. Everything is designed to help you grow your business and share what's working and what isn't. And that's true whether you're a business owner or an artist. You'll get access to feedback, live conversations with guests, and so much more. By joining the tribe, you become part of a community of creators who all support each other, and it's completely free. Hopefully I'll see you there. Visit unmistakablecreative.com/tribe to join. Again, that's unmistakablecreative.com/tribe. Michael, welcome to the Unmistakable Creative. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Hey, thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it is my pleasure to have you here. So I found out about your work by way of somebody on your team. And I think that what really struck me about the way that you have, made your way in the world as a creative person is you've somehow found that intersection between art and commerce that seems to be a mystery between for so many aspiring artists. But before we get into all of that, I want to start by asking you, what in the world did your parents do for work, and how did that end up influencing and shaping the life choices that you've made?
Wow, that's an interesting question. And I've never been asked that. My mom was a school teacher. She was a stay-at-home mom when we were little kids. And then when I got into college, she started working again to put my older brother and I through college. And then she just worked continually through that. And my dad was a career 30 years at the same company, orthopedic company in the Midwest, and was in marketing and sales and things. Didn't talk about work very much. Work was a job. It wasn't a passion for him. He wasn't entrepreneurial. I think he had entrepreneurial spirit, but it was the era of you get a job at Bristol Myers and you work there for 30 or 40 years and then you retire. That was the era pre my era, the Gen X era of people. And there's entrepreneurship seemed to be in my blood, but it didn't come from my upbringing.
No. So there are multiple questions that come to that. Your mother, as an educator, what was her view on both how you should get educated, but also like how that would influence your career choices? Because, like I used to criticize my parents a lot for sort of their very practical career advice because they're, that's just how Indians are. But then I think that one of the things that we tend to do, particularly in our generation, was we overlook context. Like you mentioned, that was the era in which your parents were raised, and often that's what determines their sort of choices, because for my parents, like their life trajectories were binary. It's either poverty or security. And so their advice made a hell of a lot of sense now, after 20 years of actually being smart enough to reflect on what they've said.
Yeah, I think I think my generation, I'm 48 years old, and I think my generation was the last American generation where you go to high school and the expectation for most graduating high schoolers was, okay, next step, you go to college and you get a degree in something that you choose, and then you go get a job, and then you work there for 30 or 40 years. I think that was the unsaid expectation that my parents raised me in. And I think that's the way that a lot of middle-class America culture was back then. And what I've seen over the span of my career is that that's completely changed, that the acceptance of going on your life journey, especially with the millennial generation, really started. You graduate from high school, which is still the expectation and should be, but then people are going and traveling the world, and they're documenting their life on social media, and they're being entrepreneurial, and the expectation to go to college for a formal education is a lot less. There's ways to self-educate now that didn't exist when I was going to college in 1990. So the environment's changed, but my parents and my mom as an educator, my dad who put himself through college, their expectation was, okay, you go to college and you get a job. And they never said it. It just was there, and it seemed logical and what was expected of me, even though they never said it. Now, what they did well was they encouraged me to pursue something that I loved for a living. And I went to Indiana University in my freshman year. I was flunking out of college like half the students at any Big Ten school. You're screwing around and you have all this freedom that you never had, and you're making stupid choices. And my grades reflected that. And that end of my freshman year, when I was on academic probation, my parents got me a book, Do What You Love, The Money Will Follow. And their encouragement was, hey, stop planning to go into business or something. Just choose a career you're going to love. And I'd always loved art, always teacher's pet in my high school art classes, took every single one of them, grew up, collecting comics and drawing and all the creative stuff. And so I thought, okay, you know what? I'm going to do that. And I'm going to be a commercial artist or a graphic designer, as we call them now. And I'll just do that for my career. And if I max out making 60 grand a year someday, maybe as some creative director, then that's what I'll make. And I'll just enjoy having a job I love. Well, lo and behold, I graduate from college, and a year and a half later, I'm making 60 grand. And a year after that, I'm a creative director. And a year after that, I'm a creative director at Fox Studios. And my actual expectation of what I could accomplish in a career as a creative was so small compared to what actually was possible.
Yeah.
I just didn't have a vision for it. And my parents, they didn't help me gain a vision for that, because I don't know if they had a vision for it. I think they're probably as surprised as I am that I've had the success in my career that I've had.
Sound plays a much bigger role in our lives than most of us even are aware of. An EPOS podcast powered by audio tells stories behind the sounds we hear every day, sounds that inform, entertain, educate, get our attention, influence our behavior, and save our lives. Randy Zuckerberg and her guests explore how audio shapes our experience and how pioneers are creating the sound of the future. You know all those sounds from your devices when you're using apps or receiving text messages or anything else online? Well, it turns out somebody actually has a job doing that. Randy talks to the experts behind these sounds to find out about the work that goes into designing what she calls those sonic logos. As a podcast host, I think a lot about how sound impacts us, whether we're hearing it on a podcast or from a notification on a phone or from some app we're using. And if you want to learn more about the impact that sound has on our lives, listen and subscribe to EPOS's Powered by Audio on Acast, iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Yeah. So I want to spend a bit more time on this do what you love and the money will follow narrative, because I think that it's so much more subtle and nuanced than that, right? It kind of takes us back to context, privilege, like, don't get me wrong, like I've been in a very fortunate position to be able to take that advice, follow it, and, get to do this. I mean, but I started when I was 30. But I feel like we perpetuate that narrative without considering the context, and we sell it to people. Like, we sell false hope to people almost to a fault. And you, I think, have built, a successful creative career. But I just had William Dershowitz here, who wrote a book called The Death of the Artist. He had another book called The Miseducation of the American Elite. It was a really fascinating conversation about the harsh truths about what it takes to actually make a living as a creative person. And he said, the probability of success is actually not high. And he said that he was hypercritical of people like Steven Johnson, who said there's no better time to start making money off your ideas because you have the internet, you have, social media. I mean, you and I are pretty close in age. Like I remember when I went to college, it would take hundreds of, hours and thousands of dollars just to build a website. Now you can do it in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
But the thing that has happened is that as you create more tools and you give more people access and you give them more permission and what Naval Ravikant calls permissionless assets, you also fragment the media landscape. The producers of Oprah even said there will never be another Oprah because it's simply not possible within the context of today's landscape. And so with that in mind, like, where do you think, what are the nuances? I mean, you've obviously, like I said, found that intersection. Like, what nuances do we miss when we perpetuate this narrative?
Well, that's a really interesting talking point. So, I guess the question, to rephrase it, why are we perpetuating a lie to people saying, okay, just be creative and you'll be, or, if you're an artist and you can love it and you're passionate about it, you can find success. And you're saying that the likelihood of that is small based on some of these other interviews.
True, right? I mean, there are plenty of people, because again, there are so many other things that play a role. If your talent obviously plays a role, that matters. We can't deny that. Background plays a role. Like if you happen to have grown up in privileged circumstances, you're what Malcolm Gladwell would call an outlier. Like you have a huge edge. I'll give you an example. I have always been reluctant to teach a podcasting course because there were so many sort of outlier advantages. Like we started 10 years before this thing becomes a cultural mega trend. I had this mentor I found on Twitter who for no reason whatsoever took me under his wing. Yeah. Like those are things I can't recreate for another person.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, okay, well, so talk about a couple of my outlier experiences that led to my success. Well, I got my job as a creative director at Fox Studios off of applying to a monster.com ad.
Yeah.
And you're not going to get that job applying off of Indeed now.
Yeah.
Unless you're already a creative director at Warner Brothers, then yeah, maybe. But I wasn't. I was part of a .com startup in Phoenix that was kid-centric. It was called okid.com. And I was the creative director of that, this little VC funded startup-y thing. And it drew attention to my resume from Fox Kids during the .com boom, where people were throwing stupid money at bad ideas.
Yeah, I know. I went to Berkeley during that time, so I remember.
Yeah, so you remember it well. And it all blew up a couple of years later, but that's the outlier anomaly for me in my career, that I can't recreate those scenarios today because they don't exist that way anymore.
No.
So, there's I guess circumstantial timing. It's fortuitous. It's we're blessed or grateful or whatever. I don't know how you phrase it, or it's the universe fills my bucket or whatever kind of metaphor we want to use for it. But here's the thing that I believe, and I'm an optimistic person. I believe that the future is going to be a lot greater than my past. And I believe that tomorrow has potential to be even better today than today. And that's the way that I've lived. And I do believe that if people stay in the game long enough, that eventually they're going to get these opportunities that come their way where the stars align just right for their magic moment to happen, when they can turn whatever their passion is into a great, successful career. I think the problem for a lot of people is that when the stars align, they're either not looking for it or they're not prepared to take advantage of it. And they never find that successful moment, that outlier thing, because they're not ready for it. And the stars aligned just perfect last night, but they were in bed when it happened. And so they didn't catch it. I think that there's a lot of that in people's careers, and especially now, not to stereotype the younger workforce of today, but if you're an ambitious, entrepreneurial, driven millennial, the world is your oyster, man, because so many of them are not. If you're ambitious and driven right now, you can really accomplish some amazing things because so many people, you mentioned entitlement or privilege, so many people don't put in the effort that it takes to yield the success that they really want.
Yeah. Well, so you're a parent, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So how has your own life experience, influenced your own experience as a parent? Because I know that you spent some time living in Colombia post, graduate school, like all those experiences, like I'm very convinced at this point that every experience, whether we realize it or not, plants a seed that connects those dots later, as, Steve Jobs said. But the thing is, you have to collect those dots to connect them. And, I think that in our, sort of previous linear, achievement oriented trajectory, there's no space for exploration in that. It was very much like, this is the path, this is, where you're going to go. And that's why I always said, like, the best that'll do is get you to a destination that somebody else has already arrived at, which kind of defeats the purpose. But as a parent, based on your own experience, how's that influenced how you're advising your kids about, this whole narrative of do what you love?
I raised my kids a lot differently than the way that I was raised. Being an entrepreneur. So my older boys, I have two older boys. One is 22 and the other one is 19 in a few weeks. And then I have a little buddy, 9-year-old, who is still at home with me and my wife. My two older boys are in college and proceeding in their futures. Now, my oldest is planning to study video. He's in his sophomore year of college and he wants to do something with video and movies and filmmaking and things. Again, creative. And then the next one is a graphic designer. That's what he wants to do, and he's studying digital media. And so I look at these two boys, and I'm not surprised that they both are choosing creative careers because they have seen how I've made that a successful life for myself. Something that I worked really hard during my kids' upbringing was to help them understand the possibility of their future and help them understand and see money differently than how I was raised. Like I said, when I was graduating from college, I thought to myself, okay, well, at least I do something I love and the money will follow. But at some point I'll be making 60 grand a year and that's where I'll max out and that's how I'll live. And that's fine. That's what I thought. My money blueprint was so small compared to what reality was. Nobody expanded that for me. Well, I raised my children with a much bigger money blueprint. The way that they perceive money, because they knew when I owned my agency, I would talk about landing the $500,000 project or that my overhead was $170,000 a month. I would have them work in college. I owned a commercial, or in high school, I owned a commercial property, and I would have them work for me to go and collect the rent check and things. So they would go and pick up the $8,000 rent check from our renter and go and deposit it in the bank. And so even at a young age, they're 15 years old and they're funneling money that's much bigger than the way that I was raised in the perception of money. And I intentionally did this for them to help them perceive possibility. If my kids aren't making more money than I made, I'll feel like I failed in my raising of them. And I think that there's, from a perpetual social standpoint, that's what most of us want. We want our kids to be more successful than we are. You want your kids to start a podcast or to just to live their creative life and have it fulfill them in some way and to accomplish something great that they can be proud of. You want that for your children. And I always envisioned that all the way from the start. It was never talking about how are we going to make ends meet for tomorrow on our, salary. It was all more entrepreneurial conversation.
Yeah. So you've brought up, 4 sort of words that I think really will form a framework for the rest of our conversation, which is kind of, I think my mind just makes mental models up as I listen to people
good,
talk.
Perfect. But, I love it.
Well, I mean, you mentioned, sort of expectations, vision, possibility, and the money blueprint. So I want to basically do this in those order, in that order. But, the thing is, expectations are such an interesting double-edged sword, right? A.R. Rahman, who's like arguably the most successful composer in the world at this point, who does all the Bollywood movies and is really, really just this brilliant musician. In my mind, the definition of unmistakable. Like, I don't understand the words of any of his music, and I love it, and I recognize it instantly. And the thing that he said, he has a documentary called Harmony on Amazon, where he goes around India and he meets different kinds of musicians. It's funny because he grew up, having lost his dad. He started his career literally just making ad jingles at an ad agency, like not kind of what you would think would be, okay, this guy's going to be the next Bollywood superstar.
Yeah.
But he said something that has always stayed with me when it comes to expectations. And he said, when you expect nothing, you get everything, or everything comes to you. Now, the thing is, we now, live in a world where you can go from idea to execution faster than any other time in history. Yeah. But I think that also creates the expectation that people will be successful just as quickly. And you have kind of seen this, over multiple decades. So how do we have this balancing act of, having like ambitious goals? I guess really where it is, how do you find this balance or this coexistence of both fulfillment and ambition?
Yeah, that's interesting because it takes time. And the lack of patience in the upcoming workforce is smaller than ever. If they're not, a lot of these millennial generation, and I don't want to be bashing on millennials because I think that there's some really interesting things happening socially in the workplace because of millennials and this mindset. But if they're not successful by their standard, 6-figure income a year or two out of school, then they feel like they're failing compared to their buddy who is starting their own VC fund or whatever. It's just this weird time in business. And Gary Vee does a great job of telling people to be patient. And, you see him ripping on somebody in his Gary Vee style where he's like, oh, so how long you been doing this? Oh, I've been doing it for 6 months and it hasn't been successful. He's like, try doing it for 6 years, then come back and talk to me, and that you gotta work and you gotta hustle for this for years and years of time. And the drive I had at the start of my career was massive. I graduated from college thinking, okay, now I'm going to go get a job at some agency. My first job was at Alpha Graphics, man, as a freaking copy dude. And so I feel like I started at the very, very bottom, and it motivated me so much to realize, I've not learned everything I need to learn to be successful. I've got to go deep on this. And I went into an exhausting effort of self-education over the next 5 to 10 years that ended up starting my agency and things and running through companies and getting promotions and things. But it all came out of this drive to self-educate. And then my agency years, the first few years. So I went from I billed 220 grand or something my first year. Couple years later, I'm billing $500,000. A year after that, I'm billing $1 million. It was just compounding on top of itself. But I didn't feel like I had substantial net worth until a decade into it. And this is a decade of billing $1 million plus a year. And then finally, I look at the bank accounts, my own bank accounts, and I'm like, wow, I got money in here now. But it wasn't like the first year that you bill $1 million and you have $600,000 of cost, and then you get taxed down to $200,000 of profit, and then you spend $100 grand on keeping your family alive and paying your bills and things, and all of a sudden you got $100,000 left after billing $1 million. It still takes time to compound that to where all of a sudden you have what people consider success. And I didn't understand that dynamic when I first started.
Let's talk about vision, because I think that, when we think about vision, like, to me, vision is also one of those things that emerges by doing the work, right? Like we weren't even called the Unmistakable Creative 10 years ago. Excuse me. That was a natural byproduct of, constantly putting out work and creating it and kind of, looking for threads. But When you think about the vision for your life then versus now and how it's evolved, and, even when you work with people, like, what is the process for somebody to, like, come up with a vision for their life? Because so often I feel like our vision, our goals are often based on external parameters or other people's expectations. It's like this, I want to be on the top of the New York Times bestseller list. And we set, outcome oriented goals, which are largely out of our control. And inevitably we become disappointed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always struggled with a couple aspects of vision. The first one is that my early vision was so small based on reality. And I think that most people probably have that as their primary problem. They think that climbing Mount Everest is not possible, so they never dream about it. They never feel ambitious enough to go and even make that a goal. Who am I to make such a big goal? Oh, I want to build an agency with 20 employees. Who am I to build such a big goal, to have such a big vision? I think that's so detrimental. Again, coming from an optimistic person standpoint, it's so detrimental to the capability that most humans have. And you mentioned some privilege and things, growing up in middle-class America, I have privileges, no question, over people that are growing up in other countries that education struggles and things. There's no question about it. But I think everybody can probably expand their vision bigger than what they do right now, especially in the world that we live in today. And you alluded to this at the start, anybody anywhere can start a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, you did it 10 years before it was the booming crazy thing, but anybody can start a podcast. You can be in a village somewhere in India and you got a cell phone connection. You can start a podcast. And if you have good ideas and you've built your ability to speak and things, it may take a lot of work for you to find success, but you can find it because the barrier to entry is so small right now on achieving whatever dream you want to achieve. You go back 15, 20 years before the era of podcasts and you want to start a radio show. Well, that's not a dream that anybody can have because you got to have money and you got to rent a studio and you got to get investors and whatever might have to happen to start your radio show. Now, somebody can decide this morning to start a radio show and this afternoon have their first episode live. It's really the barrier to entry is so small. So I think for people listening to this, expand your vision because so much is capable right now in 2020 and beyond compared to where things were before. You mentioned it too. I mean, it was starting a website. You want to start up some website? Yes, there's a lot of competition for website eyeballs, but you can decide this morning to start your website and have it live this afternoon. Mm-hmm. There's no barrier to entry on your ideas. So expand your vision and go after something.
Yeah. Well, in the interest of being very selfish and asking for a tactical example, let's say that somebody comes to you as a coaching client, me. If you were to sit down with me and go through this process of vision, where would you guide me from based on where I'm at today?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've done this a bunch of times with people. So I take them through a couple exercises. The first one is I love Tim Ferriss, and in the 4-Hour Work Week, he has his dreamlining exercise, which is a fancy way of goal setting. And he does this based on 3 things. What do you want to be? What do you want to do? And what do you want to have? And when I take people through this, it really helps you organize your life mentally on what you want to achieve. So what do you want to be? What do you want to be? You want to be a top 10 podcast on Apple. You want to be a great podcast host. You want to interview some of the greatest people in the world. You want to be known as a great public speaker. You want to be something. What do you want to do? Well, I want to climb Mount Kilimanjaro and I want to swim in a great white shark cage and I want to go and scuba dive the Great Barrier Reef and things you want to do. And then what do you want to have? Well, I want to own a Ferrari or a Lamborghini or whatever. I mean, people have things that they want to have in this world. And when you organize your goals that way, it starts to help you form the vision of what you want your life to be. And then I take my coaching students through the mindset of, okay, these are the things you want to be, do, and have. Now, how do we create a business that can help you achieve those things? What is the business that will fund these opportunities for you? Now, for me, a lot of what I want to be and do is my business. I want to be known as one of the world's greatest, most accessible creative mentors. That's what I want to be. I want to be known as that. And so what does that make me do? It makes me share all kinds of content, and it makes me have cost-effective coaching pricing. It makes me release courses that I know are going to benefit people. It makes me do a lot of things that are feeding into what I want to be or what I want to be known as. And I think breaking our goals down into those three things helps us with our vision. And then another thing I think is so powerful is just vision boarding. You know, go on to Pinterest. So get your be, do, have list, and then open up a Pinterest board that is be, and open up a Pinterest board that is do, and one that is have, and start pinning things that visually represent those three categories. And that whole experience is so powerful, especially, you know, creatives listen to this podcast. To us as visual creative people, when we start to see it in these three buckets, and all of a sudden those images get imprinted on our mind and our subconscious. And then as we go and wander around in our business dealings, we're subconsciously working to fulfill these three objectives that we have in our life. And I had so much power in that. I mean, I created a board of what I wanted my agency studio space to look like. And 7 years later, I owned a studio space that I paid and built out from a shell, and it had the glass walls and the chalkboard wall and the dry erase board room and exposed beams and all the stuff that you could look at my vision board of my studio and see the 40 photos in it from other agencies everywhere. And you'd walk around my agency and you'd be like, well, I see exactly where this came from. But it was 7 years in the making, and it all stemmed from something I wanted to have, a cool studio. And it was fulfilled in the decisions that I made mostly subconsciously over that 7 year span that eventually yielded the result of that vision.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because, you know, I think it makes me think a lot about just environment. We probably shared the story before on the show, but, you know, where I remember telling my friends, I was like, oh, if I had $1 million recording studio, I have frame prints of the people I interview on the wall. She's like, honey, you don't need $1 million recording studio for that. You need some framed, IKEA frames and, you know, printing machines. Yeah. So I did that. And it's kind of amazing because that literally is, you know, on the wall behind me. And then, you know, I was talking to Ben Hardy recently. He said, okay, so let's say we were to design the environment of the future. I said, you know, I would replace the album covers on the wall, not with people I have interviewed, with people I want to interview.
Yeah. So good. So powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about sort of possibility. And I think I want to frame it in sort of a very practical context. So you have worked with some of the most iconic brands to make, you know, creative ideas happen. What does the process for something like that look like? And how does that contrast to sort of the individual creator you see struggling to sort of get any traction with their work?
You're talking about the creative process for big brand stuff?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's similar. Like, how does it work?
Yeah, it's not different. It's just that the brand is cooler. And I thought this when I got my job at Fox Studios. So I got hired as a creative director. I was 28 years old, and I thought to myself, oh my gosh, this is going to be great. I'm going to be working with the greatest designers in all the world. I'm moving to LA. I'm working in Century City, and in the Fox Studio lot. I had an office in the freaking Nakatomi Plaza from Die Hard, and I'm like, this is great. And I'm going to be the boss of all these designers and stuff. And how am I ever going to accomplish this? And then I get in there and I quickly found out that all these designers were just as good as the designers I was working at the last company. and on unknown brands. And they're still talented, they're still good, but it wasn't anything overly special, but the assets we had to work with were amazing. And the exposure to the work was millions of people instead of thousands of people, if you're lucky with smaller brands. Yeah. But the process is largely the same. You're still ideating, you're still mood boarding, you're still understanding your target audience and target viewer, target user, and you're executing on the goals that the client has. That process is largely the same as what you do for any smaller brand. And I think, going back to something that we're talking about on vision, so don't, if you're not working with these great brands, don't make it feel like you're an inferior designer. You just haven't gotten your foot in the door yet for that great brand. But the way that you work, if you follow a standard structured creative process, the way that you work is going to translate to those bigger brands once you get that opportunity, if you can make that happen.
Is your mattress making noises it never used to? Or is it sagging, causing you to... Then it's time to get a new one. Get the best sleep at the best value with a Nectar mattress. Prices start at just $499, and you get $399 in accessories thrown in, a 365-night home trial, and a forever warranty. Go to nectarsleep.com.
This episode of The Unmistakable Creative is supported by RemoteWorks, a podcast that tells extraordinary stories of teams that made the shift to flexible working. If there's anything that last year taught us, it's that the way we work has changed forever. And in each episode of RemoteWorks, host Melanie Green tells an insightful story about how people and companies are adapting. She talks about the very problems that all of us are dealing with. Last season, in Preventing Burnout, people learned about the challenges and rewards of working remotely during the pandemic. Now, I don't know about you, but I have definitely felt that there are days when I am burned out, and sometimes I don't even know when I am done working because it's all I do. A recent study found that 75% of workers have experienced burnout, and 40% said their burnout was a direct result of the pandemic. But what if we don't know the signs of impending burnout? You'll hear firsthand from someone who has been through burnout, as well as get expert advice on how to recognize it and what you can do to prevent it from happening. In this season, RemoteWorks explores several other topics related to the new world of work. For those of you who are baseball fans that are missing those days of eating overpriced hot dogs and drinking oversized beers, they pull back the curtain at Major League Baseball for a glimpse of how America's most beloved pastime is working remotely. You'll hear how the MLB has had to adjust just about everything that they do, from new rules about how we gather to virtual fans in stadium. You'll get to look at how they've embraced this new world of flexible work. I recently listened to the Burnout episode of the RemoteWorks podcast, and here's what I thought. Melanie does an amazing job bringing in diverse perspectives from experts and people who are dealing with the issues these experts are trying to solve. It's basically a combination of great storytelling with practical advice that you can apply to your life or your work. So search for RemoteWorks anywhere you listen to podcasts. Thanks to RemoteWorks for their support.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we did a animated series for a bigger brand, on Soul Pancake, where we got the most poetic sound bites from Unmistakable and brought them to life visually. And it was interesting to see how that process works. Very much the same. It's like, oh, we're pretty much leading the project, but that raises the question of, okay, so you have an idea, you're able to execute it. How do you create that intersection, between art and commerce, basically commercializing the idea, and what role does the money blueprint play in all of that?
Commercializing the idea, rephrase that for me in a different way.
Let's say I have an idea, I'm able to execute it. How do I make that idea commercially successful, i.e. make money from it? And what role does the money blueprint play in all of that? And how do you change the money blueprint if it's one that doesn't serve you? Okay.
So you got a handful of questions in there. So how do you, it all comes down to understanding a pain point that your target customer has and filling it, and what the value of that pain point is. So you're trying to create something that will solve someone's pain, and they are willing to spend X amount of dollars to solve that pain. That's the same whether you're building a product for some podunk town company in Oklahoma somewhere versus doing a project for a Google. It's the same. And I think that creative process is the same. The money blueprint, we could go a couple different ways on talking about that as it relates to this. I mean, these bigger companies have bigger money blueprint. They perceive dollars as numbers. It's a numbers game. And as long as their budget dollar says that this project is $40,000 in their budget, and if you're under $40,000, then their numbers work. And they don't view it as dollars as much as they view it as numbers. And so you get this escalation of the price that you can charge to a lot of these bigger companies because they're just balancing their budget numbers, not so much thinking that this is money out of their pocket. And when you work with some of these smaller companies, their money blueprint is largely structured on them thinking that money is money and money isn't a number. And any money they spend is money out of their pocket and not just a balancing of their budget number versus their expense number.
No. Well, it's funny when I think about money, there's one nugget that has always stayed with me from the people I've interviewed, and it was from Samantha Bennett. And she said, you're always getting paid, and you're always getting paid in the currency that you're asking for. So she's like, if you're asking for Facebook likes, that's what you're going to get paid in. And she said, if you ask for money, that's what you'll get paid in. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because I think that, for a lot of creative people, it's almost like they feel like they're doing something wrong by asking to be paid for their work.
Yeah.
There's, wrestling with that. I mean, it's something I had to get over. It took me a long time to say, okay, you know what? Yeah, we're running a business, not a charity. We need to be okay with this.
Yeah. I think I had a post a couple, maybe a week ago or so, and it was, over the course of my agency life, I billed $30 million over a 15-year span. And I shared some of the pain projects, in this post. And it was like, I had one client that I wrote them a $54,000 check. And when I fired them and said, we can't work together anymore, here's a check of some of your money back. I had another client, I waived $70,000 of their invoices when I fired that client. I said, don't pay us the 70 grand you owe us, take your stuff and move on. And I shared some of these painful moments that I had. And I had somebody who commented on that post and said, oh my gosh, these numbers are so huge. I don't know if I could bear that. And the truth is that it all just incrementally grows over time. And you look at your own money blueprint, and when you were, in high school, $1,000 would have been a lot of money. And if you would have lost $1,000 on something, you would have been like, oh my gosh, I can't even bear this trauma of this. Well, then you get into college, you graduate from college, and to give an example, I bought some stocks in my first era of buying stocks during the dot bomb in the early 2000s. And I had a couple companies that I bought. WorldCom, I put $2,000 into WorldCom and it defunded and it was all gone. And $2,000 poof, vanished. And that back then it was like, oh, this hurts so bad. Well, fast forward from there, 15 years of agency life, and I'm writing a check to the IRS for $120,000 at the end of the year for a tax hit. And you're like, oh, well, that's my tax number. And you send it in an envelope and stick it in your mailbox. I literally did that. I paid like 250 grand in taxes. I had prepaid in my quarterlies a batch, but then I paid another 120 in one check, handwritten, put it in an envelope and stuck it in my mailbox to send it to the IRS. And it doesn't come overnight, I think, is the point I'm making. I think it's just this incremental. When you first start, $1,000 feels like a lot. Then $10,000 feels like a lot, and 1,000 doesn't feel like much. And then 100,000 feels like a lot, and 10,000 doesn't feel like much. And we reprogram our perception of money over time based on the way that our career is going. And it behooves anyone to start reprogramming their money blueprint as soon as they can. I take some of my coaching students through this when they start telling me what they're charging, and they'll tell me, oh, well, I'm struggling to charge $700 for a logo. And then I start telling them what my agency was charging for logos. We were charging like $6,500 for a logo. Same exact process that this person was afraid to charge $750 for. My agency's charging $6,500. Then we start talking about Michael Beirut and doing a rebrand where they're charging $1 million for the same work that I'm doing for $7,500 or $6,500. And it's all about reprogramming our money blueprint to perceive what reality can be for us as creatives. And it's usually much, much bigger than what most of us think. And you've probably seen that in your career. When you start, you're afraid to charge this, and you up it a little bit, and now you get comfortable with that, and then you up it a little bit. I never would have guessed 3 years into my agency, when I was doing $30,000 projects, that I'd have a $500,000 project, which we did for Kraft Foods. It was just a massive project. And we had multiple $300,000 projects. I couldn't even fathom that when I thought that 30 grand was a huge project. So we got to reprogram the way that we think about money. And I think learning about other people's businesses can help. Reading entrepreneur biographies can help. Listening to podcasts like this can help. And seeing the reality of what other people are charging and doing for the same type of work that you're doing can make a huge impact on your ability to succeed as a creative.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen people where they'll look at it as like, oh, wow, this person is doing worse work than I'm doing, and they're charging more.
Yeah.
Like, I remember the first, I think first couple of years I did public speaking, I was like, oh, a couple $100 sounds like a lot. And then you get like a pretty massive payday, like a, like 5-figure payday for a 30-minute speech. And you're like, okay, that's what's possible. Yeah. And I got to a certain point where somebody was like, oh, we'll pay you $600 to come to Texas and do a speech. And I was like, yeah, no, thanks. I could do that from an hour phone call now.
Yeah.
And even getting to that point took me a while to say, oh, my time is worth this much.
Yes. Yeah. It's a struggle. I have that struggle now. I mean, I struggle to charge what I should be charging for services that I offer now and for courses that I have. And my struggle comes from the fact that I don't need to do it for the money. I love to help others. And so I don't want to price out an audience that needs my help.
I can relate.
Yeah. But and that's why you're doing a podcast. I mean, what do you make off of this podcast? Nothing. You make feel goods for yourself. That's what you get paid in. And you get to meet amazing people and build these great connections. But from a financial standpoint, unless you have great advertisers, most people aren't making any money. It's not financially lucrative to do a podcast. But why do you do it every week? Because you want to give back to the industry and you want to build awareness of your personal brand. And it does turn into speaking gigs and things and other opportunities. But the podcast itself is largely a donation for most people doing podcasts. So it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it.
Yeah, no, I mean, we've been fortunate enough to have, advertisers and investors and all those things.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I never thought in a million years we're going to be possible. I can never imagine myself raising investor money or any of those things. It goes back to that whole idea of vision. Yeah. One thing I wonder, and this is something I always ask people who, coach a lot of people or work with a lot of people, and I asked Ramit Sethi this, and his answer was interesting. He said, it's just human nature. What do you find differentiates the people that do something and make something happen with your work and your coaching and your courses versus the ones who don't? Because I feel like you kind of get, just this, trifecta of people where it's like the person who goes out and takes action and they would have done that whether they'd taken your course or not. Then there's the person that you become the catalyst for. And then there's a person who just keeps looking for the next thing.
Yeah. Man, it's heartbreaking. I'll tell you, when I have a bunch of people that I've worked with for over a year. I started doing coaching last summer, and I, some of these first people that I coached, I still work with on a regular basis. And you see them take action and you see it transform their business. And then you sit there and when you get on the call with that person again, and they haven't fulfilled their efforts to try and change some of their sales strategies and things. And you're like, man, I gave you the freaking goose that lays the golden egg. I gave it to you on a platter. All you have to do is take the 10 steps of action that I said, and you will see results, no doubt about it. And when people don't take action, it's really kind of heartbreaking as a mentor to anyone when they don't do that. And that's what I said. I kind of alluded to this at the start. If you're an ambitious millennial, the world is your oyster, man, because anything is possible, because so many people are unwilling to take action. They're unwilling to put in the work that it's going to take to be successful. They're unwilling to do it. They're just content to turn on Netflix at the end of the day instead of spending 2 hours self-educating, which could turn into massive value in their future. And I had to, Tom and I we do the Biz Buds podcast, and we had a conversation about this. Like, what's the difference? How do you unlock this ambition? How do you unlock it in people and make somebody want to do it, to put in the work for it? And the harsh reality is that a lot of people don't. A lot of people they want to go to their day job. They want to come home and they want to have, some downtime with their kids and get their paycheck and pay their bills and get up the next day and go to work and then come home and coach their kids' soccer team. And when I'm an ambitious person, I sit there and think, oh, but there's so much more in life. You can achieve so much. But then I have to tell myself, you know what? There's nothing wrong with that either. That's a definition of success, and more power to all those people that's what they want. They just shouldn't compare themselves to a Steve Jobs or a Gary Vee or a whoever, Elon Musk. You can't compare if you're not willing to put in the same effort, make the same sacrifices that some of those people did. Yeah. And you don't get to compare your life to theirs. And I think that's where a lot of people go wrong. They start to feel discouraged that they wake up and they're 45 years old and they don't have their own VC fund like their friends. They just are still working their job that they've had for 20 years. Well, don't make the comparison. Enjoy your life. Make it be what you want it to be for you. And then don't feel bad. No. And most of those people probably aren't listening to this podcast, because a lot of those people, don't listen to podcasts because they're not in it in that self-improvement mindset.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think it brings us back to that whole sort of finding the balance between, fulfillment and ambition at the same time, because I think that, there's this sort of diminishing return to ambition when it becomes so defining that, like, we let it make us unhappy in every other area of our lives.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I lived in unhappiness for a lot of years in my agency run. I was billing tons of money, winning tons of awards, and the outside perspective was, wow, Mike's killing it. And the inside was, I was like killing myself. I was working so hard and caring so much about it that the stress load that I was putting upon myself was so high. And my drive and ambition was so heavy that, I was never satisfied. All of a sudden I've got 20 employees in a cool studio space and I'm not satisfied, even though I told myself when I had 5 employees that I would be satisfied then. And then you get there and all of a sudden you're like, oh, but there's more. Now I can go to the next mountain high. And it can be a really miserable way to live. And I focus a lot more now on enjoying every day, enjoying every coaching call, enjoying the fact that I don't have 20 employees and massive overhead that I'm trying to churn and cover. I love my life, and I focus on enjoying walking up the path as I climb the mountain rather than running up the path, staring at the top of the mountain, thinking, oh, it's going to be so great when I put my flag in the top up there. I try and smell the flowers a lot more than I did in the most of the run of my career.
Mhm. Amazing. Well, this has been really, really great and eye-opening and insightful. So I have one final question for you, which is how we finish all of our interviews, the unmistakable creative. What do you think it is that makes somebody or something unmistakable?
Oh man, that's the unmistakable creative. What do I think makes somebody unmistakable? I think it's being truly authentic to who you really are. And you know, that's the greatest personal branding tip is to be you, because there's nobody else like you anywhere else in the world, and nobody's going to have your exact same journey. Nobody has your exact same perception of the world, your exact same quirky sense of humor, or your exact same heart and the way that you care about people. Nobody has it exactly the same as you. So be yourself, and I think that'll make you unmistakable for anyone else.
Amazing. Well, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us and sharing your story and your insights with our listeners. Where can people find out more about you, your work, and everything else that you're up to?
You can follow me on Instagram. That's where I post most content, @morejanda on Instagram. But also my website, michaeljanda.com, has a links to all of my things. I do the Biz Buds podcast every week with Tom Ross. We love that show and have a great audience there. So those are just a handful of places. Written a bunch of books and have some courses and things. So check me out on michaeljanda.com and you'll find links to all my stuff.
Awesome. And for everybody listening, we will wrap the show with that.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Unmistakable Creative Podcast. While you were listening, were there any moments you found fascinating, inspiring, instructive, maybe even heartwarming? Can you think of anyone, a friend or a family member who would appreciate this moment? If so, take a second and share today's episode with that one person, because good ideas and messages are meant to be shared.
What's new in podcasting? Here's what we love, courtesy of Acast Recommends.
We often talk about the fossil fuel industry and how it affects the environment, but its impact is even more profound than most of us realize. The Crisis is a new podcast from Vice News.
Eso se oye muy lindo. Hay que hacer justicia. A mí la justicia no me ha ayudado.
This season, we're going to tell you the story of how coal, money, and the Colombian Civil War converged.
I don't feel safe going outside. I feel like something else is going on here.
The Crisis is out now. Listen for free on Spotify and wherever you get your podcasts.
Acast recommends.